In 1775, Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet stating that the freedoms of men can only be maintained by limiting the power of government. The pamphlet was called Common Sense, and today it still is common sense.
I'm Mark Zaccaria.
I'm April Giarrusso. This is Common Sense. Welcome back. As we close out the second month of calendar year 2016, we can look back on two key problems that were front and center. The one that got all the headlines was the raw exercise of power underway in the new session of the Rhode Island General Assembly. There, leaders of both chambers used sledgehammer methods to ram through favored bills or summarily execute unfavored offerings, no matter what their constituents thought. Remember the passage of truck tolls and the demise of measures to reassert Ethics Commission control over legislators? The other problem we had this month largely flew under the radar. It was the continued worsening of economic conditions here in the Ocean State. Well, you've come to the right place for coverage of both those stories and much more. This week, State Representative Patricia Morgan serves up another in-depth interview designed to give you a power briefing on what's happening in Rhode Island. On this broadcast, Pat sits down with Justin Katz of Anchor Rising fame to talk in detail about our economy and a free market policy. Between segments of that interview, Mark and I will bring a little political satire to the proceedings as we ask the eternal question, are you kidding me? Our show will conclude with another dose of wisdom and whimsy of Portsmouth's pundit Jeff Richard. Today, Jeff gives his expert opinion on dating in the 21st century. To get all this started, let's look at some of the critical analysis of three of the top news stories affecting Rhode Islanders today. Mark?
Thank you, April. We like to think we live in a representative democracy. We like to think that those Pauls who come begging for our votes every 2 years will feel some responsibility to pick up the phone if we happen to call with a problem during their term of office. Over the last couple of weeks, we've all seen proof of what we don't like to think. That collectively we are only a noisy, nettlesome ATM machine for the anointed ones who get to inhabit Smith Hill on our dime. Proof? You say you want proof? Did you see the Speaker of the House conduct a series of public hangings almost immediately after the vote on truck tolls? He demoted virtually every Democrat rep who voted against his wishes. I guess it's good to be Speaker. More proof? Okay. The same day as the toll vote in the House, the President of the Senate was publicly embarrassing a member of her caucus who pushed back against her explicit instructions to stop trying to reestablish Ethics Commission authority over the chamber. Still more, the day after the vote to float the big bond, Rhode Island DOT began hiring for 14 new management positions. The agency also announced bonuses for existing employees. None of the money for that was in their approved FY16 budget. And you thought all that bond loot was going to roads and bridges? Folks, please take a close look at what's going on around us. Rhode Islanders like you and me said no to truck tolls by a margin of 2-1. We preferred to see our state government tighten up its operating procedures and get the job done with the dedicated revenue streams we've already provided. Yeah, right. Newspaper editorials like that in the Valley Breeze and the South County Independent decried the rough handling of the voters by the elect of Smith Hill. So what? The governor reported that by the end of 2015, she'd collected over $1 million for the year, and by far most of it came from out-of-state donors. I'm sorry, what was their interest in contributing to somebody else's governor who still has years on her term? Do you see a pattern here? Does it offend you that all these insiders can do anything, no matter how costly and inefficient, and just keep sticking you and me with the tax bills to cover it all? Sure you are. The real question, though, is what are you going to do about it in November? April?
Thanks, Mark. But we could actually sustain our state, even with all the inefficient administration and extra goodies to the insiders, if we had the money. One of the things almost everyone has missed, though, is that the reason we're broke is that we just keep trying to kill our local economy. URI professor of economics, Len Lardaro, hasn't missed that point. In fact, he's been talking about it in no uncertain terms for the last several years. Most recently, his piece in Go Local Prov highlighted one of the reasons the average Jane and Joe have missed this problem altogether. We all know that every ventriloquist and nightclub magician uses a distraction to get the audience to look away from the real action. You've heard the phrase, "Oh look, it's a shiny thing." Well, Professor Laudaro has correctly identified the shiny object being used by government to keep our eyes off of the real problem. It's the monthly figure for unemployment. In his article, Laudaro reminds us that the method for computing that monthly data point has been changed repeatedly to favor the House, dating back to the Lyndon Johnson administration. Back then, the trick was to start counting U.S. military personnel on active duty. Well, that was at the peak of the Vietnam War. The huge conscript army we had then made the actual civilians who were unemployed look like a much smaller percentage of the workforce than they were. These days, it's the labor force participation rate. When young and able workers just give up and go on the dole, they are no longer counted, which also skews the percentages. So today, when we hear that the unemployment rate is at its lowest point in years, we tend to ignore that gnawing pain we still feel, right in the pocketbook. Instead of hanging on the unemployment rate the way a non-investor watches the Dow Jones Index, the professor recommends the Current Conditions Index, or CCI. That number is a composite of a dozen different economic indicators, and it is calculated by economists, not the government. Len Laudaro's Current Conditions Index sits today at 58. That's down from its November value of 75, continuing its slide from last April's high of 91. Remember, when the trend arrow on the chart points down, the patient isn't doing too well. Here's why. Manufacturing hours were down almost 3% in December versus November. At the same time, the average manufacturing rate declined too. Housing permits were off 11.5% in December, year on year. Consumer sentiment and even government employment were both off in the latest CCI report. That's why it still hurts, even when the unemployment numbers seem superficially good. And the reason all those other indicators are going south? Well, in large part, it's because of government intervention. That's what it is, folks. When the state moves to suck tens of millions of dollars of ready cash out of the local economy with truck tolls. Government needs to just step away from the economic levers and buttons. They are not toys, guys. But until the Smith Hill team stops inducing this negative growth by continued bad economic policies, that vague sense of pain in your pocketbook will only continue. Mark?
Thanks, April. So what happens when a state like ours is caught in the vice between leaders insisting on feeding their friends and economic conditions getting worse and worse? Well, that's simple. The middle class takes it in the shorts. If the same dollar hit is taken by everyone, it represents a much larger bite out of total assets for the middle class than it does for the wealthy. Meanwhile, those on the lower rungs of the economic ladder can be buffered from the hit by the safety net. That very point was made in a recent Wall Street 24/7 study that was reviewed in USA Today. The eventual result of the constant strain of economic conditions in a state or region was found to be migration. That is, middle-class flight from economically difficult places to live to places where there is more growth and therefore more prosperity. Would it surprise you to hear that, according to the study, the number one state in the union when it comes to economic emigration to improve economic conditions is Rhode Island? Of course not. We all have friends and neighbors who have pulled up stakes and moved on to the Carolinas, Florida, or Texas. If you're like me, you can't really argue with them about the wisdom of their decision. Too bad it's not recognized as the leading indicator of disaster that it is by our elected officials. All they seem to be able to do is exchange high fives and shout, "We're number one!"
Thanks, Mark. Is there like a giant foam finger for winning that championship? No? No. Too bad. It would have been a good souvenir to sell at the airport. In the departure lounges, of course. Now that we've depressed everyone with the news of the day, let's try to shift your spirits just a little. Before we get to the first segment of Representative Pat Morgan's interview this week, let's take a time out for a question. You know the one. Are you kidding me?
Okay. The kid brings home a bad report card, so the parents are furious. And they take it out on the school. How could you give our little angel such poor grades? So the school shrugs and changes the kid's numbers to look better than they really are. In what parallel dimension does that scenario make any sense at all? Are you kidding me? Well, apparently it's the parallel dimension inhabited by Rhode Island State Representatives McNamara, Bennett, Azzanaro, Malik, and Diaz. I say that because they just got together and submitted House Bill 7131, a Board of Education Act. If made law, this little beauty requires the Board of Ed to create an all-new statewide literacy test to determine how well our public school students are doing. This new test is intended to replace the PARC test, at which anyone with any political clout's kids did so poorly last year. Johnny and Joni scored badly on the test. What'll we do? I know, we'll reinvent the wheel, no matter what it costs, no how much time it takes, so we can be done with the PARC test and once again feel better about how well we are educating our children. Are you kidding me?
We recently caught up with Jean Gagnier, freshman counselor from Westerly. Let's listen in.
We work well. We play well with others. What we're working toward is making government more effective. We've done things. We've also put in our appointments process, which is now as transparent as possible. We have a budget with a fine-tooth comb. We went through with line item by line item. And when we did that last year as a freshman, first time I was looking at the budget, we found a $1.4 million spending gap in that we were running a deficit at our transfer station. So we're doing a rational approach to government, making it more effective, and we're working with the people of Westerly. We've got a lot of good support.
Welcome to Common Sense. This is the program where we try to make sense out of the policies that affect your life and come up with common sense solutions. I'm Representative Patricia Morgan, and I have with me today Justin Katz, who is the managing editor of Anchor Rising and the Ocean State Current, and also the research director for the Center for Freedom and Prosperity. Welcome.
Thank you.
That's a mouthful. You're pretty busy.
Yeah, well, in the free market movement, you have to do a lot of work to get paid, so we had to pile on all the titles.
All right. Well, that's a lot of titles, and that's a lot of work. But I've read a lot of the stuff that's on your, it's an online newspaper. How do people find it, first of all?
Well, oceanstatecurrent.com would be one way. Anchorrising.com will go to the same place.
Okay, oceanstatecurrent.com.
Yep.
All right, and I've seen it. You have different articles every day, right? Are they all written by you, or?
Well, Anchor Rising started about 10, 11 years ago as a group blog, and we found over the years, because we all live our lives, some people write a lot for a little bit and then fade away, and others fill in the gap. At the moment, we seem to be on a swell of other people starting to write a little bit more here and there. But it's a difficult endeavor to keep up year after year after year. So most of the content tends to be mine, but we also accept submissions from people in the public who have something they want to say.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, it takes a lot of research to write any article in there. It's not just straight opinion. You actually have to know what you're talking about.
Right. Well, that's what kind of hooked us, or hooked me anyway, years ago, was when I discovered how easy it is to research, just a little bit of research, and prove that the people who are supposed to know what they're talking about don't know what they're talking about. And you make a chart, and it's a lot of fun. So I kind of got into the research in that way. So it's definitely one of the advantages of the internet is you can do the research, provide the links to the sources, and it's pretty easy to make a good argument.
Yeah, a compelling case. Mm-hmm. Here in Rhode Island, we have so many of the Democrat or the liberal or the progressive talking points, and we don't have a lot of people who are saying, oh, wait a minute, there's another side to this story, right? And that, hey, maybe you should consider this. I think that's one of the really hard things about Rhode Island is, so people think it a lot of times, but they don't have anybody to actually put it out there and kind of make it more legitimate, to have a more conservative point of view and say why the conservative point of view would help them in their lives more.
Right. Well, and just to articulate it and to apply it to what's going on, a lot of people, I find they get caught up in the battle of an issue, and they don't necessarily think about how their principles should apply. So it does take, there is some work to do explaining to people how you get from your beliefs and your basic understanding of how society ought to work and what policy conclusions you ought to come to.
Yeah, so often I talk with people who say they're dyed-in-the-wool Democrats, right? And we'll be talking and they'll be sitting there agreeing with me on just about everything I say. And then you step back and say, well, why are they voting Democrat all the time? Because their views are really more conservative. They live their lives kind of with some fiscal responsibility, and they believe people should, work for what they get and all this, and yet they'll go into the voting booth and...
Well, it's almost in some regard a conditioned response. I mean, we've had decades of one point of view, and growing up, even during the Reagan 80s, every villain is a businessman or a Republican or a conservative, and over again, that's just drummed into people. I worked for construction for a number of years, and one of my employers was very, very conservative, religious guy, principals, business owner, was all free market, and he just thought, oh, Democrats, they're for the little guy, right? And
it's not how I see it anymore, to be honest with you. I've been up there too long.
Exactly. It just becomes a truism that they have to believe. And then it gets wound up in people's identities. So some years ago, my father-in-law always voted Democrat, and I finally convinced him when Patrick Kennedy was running again not to vote for Patrick Kennedy. So he just stayed home. He couldn't bring himself to go vote not for a Democrat. So there's a lot, and I'm sure among some Republicans there's that attitude as well. The Republicans just tend to be on the right side of most issues in Rhode Island at this time in history.
Yeah, I do believe it's just a conditioned response, though, that a lot of people say, oh, my grandmother would roll over in her grave if I didn't vote Democrat. And I want to say, no, I don't think so. I think your grandmother would want you to do what's right for you and for the state.
Well, not only that, but it's becoming increasingly clear that the mainstream view right now, or the mainstream view when that grandmother was active in voting, even 20, 30 years ago, right now would be considered crazy right-wing stuff. If you look at JFK or something,
That's right.
Their views were very much in line. Things that were said to be unthinkable in the 70s as far as going to the left are now being pushed as what you have to believe. And I think if a lot of people paused and evaluated, what do I believe and how does this apply to what's actually happening, and kind of challenged that Democrats are for the little guy notion.
Well, I mean, one of the things Donald Trump has brought up is like the immigration debate, and just that sense that people here are not being listened to. Nobody's against immigrants, right? Nobody is against. My mom was an immigrant. Everybody's parents or grandparents were immigrants. But it's the illegal part of it. And I've even talked with Democrats, and they're just mad as could be about how many illegals are coming. And that it's kind of hurting them, right? It's depressing wages here. So you say, so how do you vote? Well, Democrat. Well, okay, how does that work for you?
Right. Well, what the progressives, not necessarily just Democrats, but what progressives have done to our politics is to break it up so that everybody has their sort of identity group. And I think for my father-in-law, for example, he was just the kind of person that was kind of an identity group kind of thing. There are other groups that are bought off. They get the special deal. They get the far left liberal views, or they get labor union handouts from a particular party, the Democrats. And over the years, it has changed to the point that the people aren't getting the deals they think they're getting, and need to reconsider maybe how they vote and have a contentiousness. We saw it with the tolls. One of the things that was nice about the toll battle was it started to bring things into real stark view. The fact that there were options from the Republicans and from the Center for Freedom and Prosperity, that makes a big difference, because it takes away the talking point of, oh, well, we have to fix the roads and bridges, and this is the only option. Well, no, there
were a lot of options on the table.
Exactly.
There were 3 really good options that I could see on the table. Any one of them or a combination of them would have worked, but the insiders wanted it They want tolls. There's no doubt in my mind they want that spigot so they can turn it on and they can turn it up. Right? They want perpetual money flowing into the government. And you know, I mean, I fought that really hard, but every Republican fought that, and we fought that for the little guy. We weren't fighting that for the insiders. We weren't fighting it for the big guys or the rich guys. We were fighting it for everyday Rhode Islanders who we know are going to hurt from this. And I think, why? I know people will still go into the voting booth in November and they'll say, well, the Democrats are for the little guys. And I wonder why we can't break through that. Conditioning.
I don't know.
Anyway, when we come back, I do want to talk with you about what free market principles are. So we're going to take a break right now and we'll be right back.
Bill H7199 has hit the House floor, and it promises to protect the community by limiting weapons to under 10-round capacity. Are you kidding me? H7199 is sponsored by Representatives Regenberg, Carson, Agello, Handy, and Almeida. It begins with a thorough definition for every term used in the description. The issue of this bill comes down to high-capacity magazines, which means in this bill, any ammunition-feeding device with a capacity over 10 rounds. You may be someone who strongly believes in guns and having guns. Or you may be someone who is strongly against guns. And there are probably around 1 million opinions in between. I personally don't see why anyone outside of law enforcement or military needs a machine gun, and I was raised around guns. I respect and fear them as I ought to, so I figured today I would do a little show and tell. This is a legally obtained 9mm Ruger. Notice that it is obviously not loaded, despite that I will not be pointing it toward my face, because I am not a stupid idiot moron. This, under proposed Rhode Island law, is a high-capacity magazine, which, if H7199 passes, will be given to the proper authorities for disposal. In contrast, this is not a high-capacity magazine. The difference between these two magazines is about 8 rounds. I have 8 rounds less in my smaller magazine, which is most definitely so difficult to load or reload that it would obviously diminish this weapon's ability to hurt people. I'm not trying to be flippant about gun safety. It is a huge issue in America, and we need to act effectively and efficiently. The truth of the matter is that it will not take 8 rounds for this weapon to be used to inflict harm. All it takes is 1 bullet. All it takes is 1 knife. All it takes is 1 arrow. All it takes is 1 well-placed icicle. The bill will not make Rhode Islanders safer. What I want to see from my representatives is action on the real problem behind the gun control issue: violence. We have a culture of violence, and it doesn't matter what weapon someone uses, whether it is a knife, crossbow, shotgun, or a gun. If we do not do something to target the issue of violence, it's a tall order. And I do commend anyone who works toward the goal of overcoming this issue in our society. But feel-good measures that do nothing detract from the real cultural issue, and that is the problem of violence being part of the norm. And since I brought a gun on air, I'm pretty sure you're asking the question, are you kidding me?
Welcome back. I'm Representative Patricia Morgan, and today we have with us Justin Katz, who is the Research Director for the Center for Freedom and Prosperity and the Managing Editor of Anchor Rising. Justin, we were talking about free market principles. You know, here in Rhode Island, there's this constant, jobs in the economy. I think it's just a talking point for my other colleagues. 5
years, I think so.
Yeah, I don't think they know what free market principles are, because as much as we say we need to do reform of regulations and stuff, now we have the speaker saying he's going to get rid of the one office that actually looks at regulations and is trying to rein them in. And regulations is a big thing that stifles the free market. But I'm wondering if you will tell our viewers just explain to them what you work for when you talk about free market.
Okay, well, the basic idea is that all of us sort of working together out of our own incentives and with our own specialized knowledge about our own lives and ourselves, what we want to do when we grow up and how we're going to do it, make better decisions as a whole than anybody possibly can standing at the top in the governor's office saying, okay, we're going to invest in this industry, we're going to regulate this, we're going to tax that to pay for that.
So central planning,
right. The central planning
versus having everybody just try to use their own money,
right,
make their own decisions.
Exactly. I used to use often when I was a little more active, the image of windsurfing. You kind of have to trust that you're going to lean back and the wind is going to keep the sail up. Free market says, lean back, it'll take you. Central planning doesn't believe that the people will actually carry society forward in a good way unless they're told very regimentedly how it's going to go, and which tends to indicate that what progressives and central planners really want are to push policies that they know people don't like, but they have to sell them on the fact.
But they're good for them, like, right. Take this medicine, it's really going to be good for you.
Well, in early progressives 100 years ago, it was euthanasia, killing off populations that were substandard. That was going to be better for us. That's an extreme version in the past.
Yeah.
But it's a good representation of how they're trying to sell something that isn't saleable.
All right, but when we talk about free markets, we're not talking about getting rid of all regulations altogether, right? Because that's not good either. Right. There is a happy medium somewhere. We try to take off as many as we can. Mm-hmm. We give people freedom with their own money, with their own lives, their own decisions. But there still has to be regulations, like you have to stop at stop signs.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mentioned earlier the idea of information, and there's nobody in a central position who can
know it all.
Who can know it all. So what the free market approach usually is not to, and people on the internet try to nail me down with things, well, what are you going to do about this and that? The idea isn't necessarily to have a prescription of this is how we're going to organize society, because then you're just central planning by a different set of rules. Yeah. The free market idea always goes in hand with a small government, low localized government, sort of federalist idea, where at the lowest position that you can find that balance for you and your neighbors and your community, where we're regulating this but you're free to do that, that's the best model to have, because then everybody can find the area that works for them, merging with their principles and their own hopes and dreams. That's kind of the basic idea of
yeah, I often think of there's a collective wisdom out there when we talk about statewide policies, about listening to our constituents, listening to all those many, many voices out there, because each of them looks at it slightly different from their own perspective, mm-hmm. but they tend to come to a consensus, all of those voices. Not all of them, but you get, I actually trust constituents and kind of the general public to look at things, and if they're given really all the information, of coming up with a good idea, a good choice.
Right. Well, the challenge is we end up with the problem that people disagree in some fundamental ways. So there really has to, a lot of people, particularly our current governor and people who share her worldview, like to say we need to get everybody on board, headed in the right direction, and no, not really, because our governing system and freedom is sort of designed to make us work together, even though we aren't on the same page, mm-hmm. as much as we can. I read just about all the legislation that goes through the General Assembly, and it always drives me to drink, because the question that keeps popping into my mind is, who do you think you are? The people who want to, a young guy elected on the east side of Providence wants to tell employers how much they have to pay or how much vacation time they have to give, and just the level of regulations that people think is fair, to say, oh, well, the cable company has to let you buy your box at a fair market price rather than rent it. Or maybe that's good policy, I don't know, but I don't think...
But you could work with the businesses to come up with something that's good for everybody.
Right, or...
Instead of just imposing it. I guess my sense is you're saying you shouldn't be imposing it on everybody. You should allow different sides to come together and come and either agree to disagree or come to some common ground.
Right, but also pushing that down to the lowest area possible. So you're not telling people always want to, because I'm conservative in a number of ways, want me to jump on board in cultural fights or small issues in a local school district fight in Westerly, say, and I'm in Tiverton. And for the most part, I'll express my opinion, but say, I'm not there. I don't live in Westerly.
Sure.
If Westerly wants to do that, maybe they should. For example, I think it's North Kingstown, for example, has a middle school that's now operating under non-violence principles. And as you read into it, it really starts to look like a religion. Now, I'll express my views that I think you're establishing a religion in your school, but on the other hand, if North Kingstown's happy with that, I don't think I ought to go to the State House and have a law passed to prevent...
That they can't.
Exactly, sure. And that applies to business as well. If a local company in Tiverton wants to do something and the people in Tiverton are fine with that, maybe somebody in Burrillville, or more likely Providence, shouldn't be the one saying, this is how you have to organize, or we saw with Roadmap Rhode Island, this is how your community ought to be set up.
Yeah.
We've got a bunch of experts from Washington who've told us that this is the way to go. Boom, you have to do it. That's really constraining, and it starts to burden the engines of our
and
freedom.
It becomes, I think, a real issue when we take everybody's money and decide that the leaders know best how to spend it, right? Instead of leaving it in their pocket.
Right.
I'm looking at the governor's tax incentives out there. Well, I know that we have to give tax incentives, but to me, thank you for that little bit of chagrin. To me, it's about making Rhode Island a better place to do business in, rather than taking taxpayer money and buying businesses. Saying, come here, we'll give you taxpayer dollars.
Well, what's so insidious?
We're picking who gets it, first of all, instead of just them wanting to come.
Right, and what becomes so insidious is it becomes a way of buying businesses off. And a lot of the conversation we hear, we want the Brookings report, the Brookings Institution report that Raimondo had some of her donors purchase. They're talking about the coveted millennials that we want to bring into Rhode Island, where really what state government ought to be doing is saying, what do our people who are here right now want? Because that's who we're supposed to be representing. And
just working on reforming those things that are driving maybe our more successful out, right?
Well, keep them here.
Keep them here. Make it good for everybody here already.
Yeah, but they want to switch out. I think the people who run the state want to switch the demographics and the kind of people who live here to get more people who want them for dependency and few people want to be.
Well, we'll see about that. Anyway, we're going to take a break and we'll be right back.
Rhode Island Board of Elections Executive Director Robert Kando is a real friend of Common Sense TV. His hijinks with candidates and his bull in the china shop management technique have made him a star of our satire segments. So, after all that prior attention, do you think Mr. Kando is done providing us with new material? Are you kidding me? Not by a long shot. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Kando rides again. When last we left our intrepid ham-fist of the executive suite, he had narrowly avoided dismissal from his state job by a tie vote in the board of directors meeting to consider that action. Inexplicably, two of his most vocal critics on the board had abstained from that vote. Later, Mr. Kando was suspended without pay for 3 weeks for poor job performance. We're only guessing here at Common Sense, but we imagine those two critics actually did vote that time. Now it has been revealed that Mr. Kando's recent efforts to run the Board of Elections have resulted in his drawing an $85,000 plus court-awarded settlement to be paid by you and me, as well as substantial legal fees. This all stems from his summary dismissal of Miss Andresa Skipworth. She had been Kando's confidential secretary for 8 years. According to Jennifer Bogdan's reporting in the Providence Journal, Ms. Skipworth had made allegations in 2014 of mismanagement at the Board of Elections. Her claims had been investigated by the board's attorney, Raymond Marcaccio. His explicit advice to Kando was that her job performance was at or above par, and that any adverse actions taken against her would be difficult for the board to defend. So, without any advance notice to the board of directors, Kando terminated his confidential secretary. She responded by amending her claims against the organization to include retaliation against a whistleblower. Robert Kanda was actually fired from state employment in the 80s. He reappeared at the Board of Elections and apparently should have been fired from that job last summer. Now his continuation in that position has cost the taxpayers, a local employee, Ms. Skipwell, a bucket of money, her settlement, and even more degradation of the reputation of government with all of us. Are you kidding me?
Welcome back. I'm Representative Patricia Morgan, and we're here with Justin Katz, who is the managing editor of Anchor Rising and the research director for the Center for Freedom and Prosperity. Justin, we were just talking a little bit about all of the incentive packages or programs that the governor is proliferating through Commerce, the old Economic Development Corporation, which is now Commerce Corp. Just kind of giving taxpayer dollars out there, making it available to bring companies here. And I have a hard time doing that because I think it works against taxpayers in some respect. It certainly works against businesses that are already here who aren't getting those benefits. If we talk about free market principles, is there a role for tax incentives?
Well, maybe a limited one at a lower level. To some degree, it's easy to take my position on these sorts of things because you can do the old saw about it's pornography when you see it. Right now we're so far gone giving the government and this quasi-public corporation tens of millions of dollars of a slush fund. It's easy to say that's too much. Right? We need to pull back from that. To the extent that there are incentives. I think when you get to the point when you can say, you know what, our state has done so much to lower tax burdens and regulations and take away roadblocks to people. We've done all of that, and now this particular company that would be great for our state is having some trouble. Maybe we can help them. Once we're to that point, but right now, and it's another area, as I mentioned before, where the toll issue has gotten very, very clear and brought clarity to the conversation. We're watching. You may differ, but I think we're watching the Ocean State job lot kind of being bought off in front of us. I mean, they came out against the tolls, and the governor and the Speaker of the House said, "Oh, wait, we'll give you stuff," and that's an ongoing debate now. And Ocean State job lot kind of backed off and said, "Oh, let's see how much you want to give us," and that's a disturbing thing.
And we'll talk about the tolls in a minute, but I just wanted to finish up with what government shouldn't be doing. And I read an article, and I'm trying to think where it is now, but it was about Massachusetts, which we all look at. It's doing pretty well. It's kind of pumping away. And one of the things they did was really limit tax growth. And this was 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And when the article that I read made the case that tax burden really does have a significant effect on business creation, on growth of businesses, and upon, citizen well-being, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. You're taking it away from citizens. They can't buy at the store. The store is giving it to the government. They can't buy product. They can't invent the next new widget or whatever. So it's all of the things that we're doing at the State House and through regulation that kind of saps the strength of job creators. I mean, I know the progressives don't like us to call businesses job creators, but they are.
Well, more than that, what it does is it prevents our business community, our market, our community from directing resources where it fits because that person opening that company in this town wants to put in the effort and people want it, so the resources go there naturally. But when government gets involved, confiscating money through taxes and then redirecting it through programs or putting regulations to protect certain industries, what you end up doing is you end up subsidizing a business or even a whole business model that isn't necessarily right for the people who are here. For some other reason than that it's economically sound and serves the community.
And not necessarily a wise use of resources.
Right, well,
so let's talk about the tolls here, because we're going to be giving DOT, which is a dysfunctional department, a ton of money. Do you know what a ton is?
2,000 pounds?
It's a lot. Yeah. It's a lot. And, you just mentioned Ocean State Job Lot. Actually, I have no problem with them going and saying, we want tax relief. Right?
Well, they have to do what's right for their...
They have to do what's right for their company.
Businesses and their customers and their shareholders. The problem is that...
Well, they don't have shareholders, but they have a lot of employees. They have a lot of suppliers. They have a lot of manufacturers who sell them stuff that they then sell out. And they're saying we have to be healthy to keep all of those folks healthy.
But if you look at it, what we're watching play out is this targeted toll that's supposed to, focus on out-of-state businesses that cause the most damage to our roads and all that kind of stuff. It turns out it's going to affect a local company pretty heavily. I mean, roughly speaking, by their estimates, they would be covering about 1/50th of all the toll revenue. And so what do? We say, well, we'll take that burden off of you and give you subsidies from the general fund, from a fancy refinance that gave Commerce Corp its slush fund. But generally, we all have to cover that now.
That's
so in
right.
essence, we're covering that toll. And so maybe that money that some businesses are having to cover for the slush fund to Ocean State Job Lot would have been the big innovative thing like the Slater Mill was hundreds of years ago.
There's why I absolutely agree with you is I don't have a problem with Ocean State Job Lot advocating for themselves. Every company, every family needs to advocate for themselves. What I have a problem with is government came in and just whacked everybody with the $45 million mandate, basically. Well, they're just confiscating $45 million from our economy.
Well, not only that, but they've confiscated, as I say, the slush fund, which allows them to play little games. So Ocean State Job Lot was creating a problem. So they had political power in that respect. So the governor can say, here's some money, stop complaining. And it really becomes a patronage system where if you can make enough noise...
They're paying for their silence.
Right, exactly. Stephen Pryor, who's the executive director of the Commerce Corporation, was on Newsmakers the other day. And on Channel 12.
With the owner of Job Lot. I imagine they had a conversation then.
Yeah, well, according to the reporters afterwards, they did bump into each other. But one of the things I found very striking about and chilling almost about his commentary, Stephen Pryor, was when asked by Tim White of Channel 12, does this, even with the incentives and all that, the road improving the economy and all that, is that going to break even for Ocean State Job Lot? And Pryor's response was, well, look, they get tens of millions of dollars and road work, the land that they're on, the government paid.
You mean they didn't build that?
Right, exactly. It was exactly that. And so suddenly, this job creator is being presented by the government representative as like a welfare queen who can't talk. You can't talk. You've gotten tens of millions from us. Later in the program, by prompting from Tim White to see if there's anything in the pipeline good that's going to come from the Commerce Corp, Pryor said, well, we've got a 20-person company from Attleboro who's going to move when we give them some incentives. So on the one hand, he's telling taxpayers, give this small company some money because it's worth it to have a move here. But now if that company ever complains and says, well, you're changing the deal on us here with this new tax, suddenly there'll be a welfare queen. And that's how the government starts to kind of take over.
Well, they're picking winners and losers. They're deciding who gets the benefit and who pays for the benefit. Right.
Well, but more than that, they're requiring everybody to come to them for approval, for handouts, for a special dispensation. It's feudal. It's almost like a medieval system we're going back to.
Yeah, and the worst thing about this is if you're a big company, you get the tax incentives. If you're a little company already here, you just pay for them.
You go to a different state.
Or they leave. That's right. We're going to take a break right now on that somber note, and we'll be right back.
A House Democrat voted against the party and was demoted from the House Finance Committee. Are you kidding me? I kid you not. Representative Raymond Hull of District 6, which includes Providence and North Providence, voted against Governor Raimondo's roadworks infrastructure and toll plan. He was one of the few Democrats to vote against the plan, and so Speaker Mattiello took him off of the House Finance Committee and put him on a less prestigious one. What makes this remarkable is Hull himself. He freely admits in an interview with the Valley Breeze that he remembers who elects him, so he listened to his people. Let me take a pause for dramatic effect there. He goes further to say that his vote wasn't just about the people who put him in his position, but also because he had to vote for what he believed was right. Again, I believe a dramatic pause for effect is needed. The gentleman stood up for what he believed instead of following the party line, and now he has suffered the consequences. But what makes him truly magnificent is his reaction to the punishment. He has no disrespect for the governor or the House Speaker, and he says that his demotion is just the ugly side of politics that goes with the territory. He understands the nature of the business, and the fact that politics are run like this is the truly outrageous part of the story. But as long as we have representatives like Mr. Hull, who remember why they were elected, who elected them, and that you are allowed to think for yourself, we may just be able to work together for a better Rhode Island. How many other representatives like Mr. Hull do we have in the House? Are you kidding me?
Welcome back. I'm Representative Patricia Morgan, and we have with us as our guest Justin Katz, who is a research director with the Center for Freedom and Prosperity, and you're also the managing editor for Anchor Rising.
And the Ocean State Current.
And the Ocean State Current. And recently you wrote an article about the Supreme Court. Justice Scalia just died, and obviously it's on all of the news programs. He was a conservative justice. He was considered just a titan when it came to constitutional principles, originalist, is that what you call it? He created a balance there. There's kind of 4 conservative justices, 4 liberal justices, and then there's one in the middle who kind of goes both ways. Kennedy. So it is really an important decision who gets on the Supreme Court. Wondered if you tell our viewers a little bit about your research into the Supreme Court, how the process works in picking a new one.
Well, it's not all that complicated by the rules of the Constitution. The president nominates somebody, appoints them essentially, and the Senate, as is practiced in the state and on other issues, other positions, offers advice and consent, which means basically they get to say yes or no on the president's proposed candidates. And immediately upon, because we're in this position where it's the 4-4 split with one unpredictable vote in the middle, immediately it became, everybody had to harden into their positions to say either President Obama gets to, it's his right and responsibility, I think is the tested phrase that they're using, to appoint whoever, whenever there's an opening. And that's been...
It's his to nominate.
Right. Well,
but not appoint. He nominates
exactly.
somebody, but the Senate actually approves its advice and consent. So unless you bring the Senate along, it's not going to happen.
Right. Well, but I think it was a Politico writer, which it tends to be pretty left-wing bias toward a particular party with a donkey as their mascot. But he wrote out, "Wow," on Twitter, the Senate is going to deny the president his right to appoint. Well, no, they're asserting their right to approve or not approve, and it's actually if I were a historian 100 years from now looking back, I think it'd be a good lesson in how our government ought to work when the president has spent 7 years being divisive, going around the Constitution, insulting members of the other party, doing a lot of things that they might work in local Chicago politics where you're butting heads and it's bare knuckle brawling.
But it is the checks and balances,
right, exactly.
balance that our founding fathers actually devised, right?
And one of
it's just not one person gets to make all the decisions. It's really all 3 branches, equal there is a checks and balance that's built into our system, which is healthy.
Right, and my point being that one of the brilliant aspects of that construction is that it should create incentive for the president to say, you know what, I'm not going to isolate and insult the people in that chamber or any other party, because what happened to him? He lost both chambers of Congress, the House and the Senate, and now he's spent so much time beating on those people and doing things that their constituents don't want, that the Republicans in the Senate really, I don't think, can cave.
And there we go to that collective wisdom of the people out there. Just one person, he's not the monarch.
Right.
He has to look for somebody to nominate that can draw kind of the consensus that this would be a good person to be on there, right? He can't put somebody that everybody's going to go, no.
Well, yeah, in the ordinary course of events, we've kind of, with this particular nomination, we've almost stepped beyond just that to as I'm saying, the idea that a large number of Americans just don't trust anybody who Barack Obama would want to appoint.
That's right.
Sure, if he goes out to, say, the Reason Magazine or the Reason Foundation or Institute for Justice, which is a relative free market conservative kind of legal institute, and find somebody there who's going to be just as originalist as Scalia was, then maybe people would say, okay, you can appoint this person.
That tension is good, right, on the court where they're deciding big ideas for our country, because you have to have that mixture, and you have to, really smart people are talking to one another and coming up with where's the right course, right? You can't, if you have all one side or the other, you're not going to have the balance.
Well, I would differ with you only in that.
You may.
Oh, thanks. Only in that it depends what the differences of opinion are. I mean, what Scalia was championing, one of the articles I read today pointed out he was, yes, conservative himself, but the positions he would take weren't necessarily
conservative
partisan
or liberal.
So, for example, saying yes some decades ago, you can burn the American flag. Personally, he might find that abhorrent, but it's in the Constitution that that's so. If every justice on the Supreme Court held that view of the Constitution, I don't know that we need to balance that. It's with the other view, which it's almost
that it's a living document, right, and we can change it.
We can change it however we want, and I mean it's almost impossible to imagine the four progressive justices, I think we could call them that, ever doing anything that progressive activists wouldn't want them to do. You know how they're going to vote, and that's not healthy either. Now, you do need a diversity of opinion, and there are shades of originalism where you might do well to have some justices really pushing on the concept of being able to adapt the Constitution to particular instances. But.
Well, all right, so let's talk about some of the things that the court decides and why it's important who sits there. And one of them is executive orders, right? I think the court has overturned even some of the executive orders that President Obama has put out, the appointments to the Labor Relations Board. And now there's one coming up. I think they were going to hear it. I don't think they've heard it yet. They were going to hear it on when he just said, well, I'm just going to make this group of illegal immigrants, I'm going to give them legal status. And that wasn't going through the Congress. And I know that it's hard to go through Congress. You've got to get out there. You've got to convince. You've got to, work with them, try to change your opinion a little, or their opinions, to craft something. But he didn't even try to do that.
Well, in fact,
not my opinion. He didn't even try to do that. Yeah. And it's hard to do, no doubt. Well, it's not. I think there are certain steps you take, and I think it can be accomplished. But
it's hard to do when you're trying to do something that the people don't want you to do, when you're trying to force a policy that the American people don't want. And it was the same thing with Obamacare. that was forced through a closure vote on a Christmas Eve. totally party line. The people of Massachusetts elected a Republican to go to Congress to stop the bill, in essence,
Sure.
and they still pushed it through. So it's hard when you're trying to do something that the public doesn't want, which is how it's supposed to work, is
Sure.
the public gets to stop it.
So that's one thing that they do, that the Supreme Court does. There's, Second Amendment rights.
Right. Well, there's a big union labor.
Yeah, whether people
Right
can
to
be
work
forced
decision
to join a
being
union,
seen.
even if they don't agree with it.
Right. So there was a lot on the docket at this point.
Yeah, and now we have to wait. But I'm sure I'm hoping they'll find a good justice to replace.
I'm hoping they wait.
I'm hoping they wait a little bit too. But, okay, well, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week.
I was reading the February 14th edition of the Projo and ran across an article actually written by a Projo staffer versus the AP grab. Jenna Pelletier informed me that once again, Rhode Island made it to the not-so-good list. More specifically, Providence is the second worst dating city in the entire country for young college-educated women seeking a college-educated man. Seems there are 60% more women than men with college degrees. Of course, that could have something to do with the fact that Rhode Island College had a 66% female enrollment in 2014. Yep, the girls are going to Rick and the men are not. All the data comes from author John Berger, a Brown graduate who has written a book with lots of ideas to help young women get married. Now, I wasn't shocked by this phenomenon. For years, I have been warning about the gender reversal in higher education. Used to be lots of boys' schools and girls' schools. Now it's boys and girls' schools with mostly girls. Okay, so the girls are looking for equally smart young men and failing. So Mr. Berger and lots of other sociologists have come up with lots of suggestions to level the playing field. Unfortunately for Rhode Island, one of the suggestions is to move. Where to? Well, the ladies have to move somewhere the numbers work out better for them. Seems San Francisco, anywhere in the Silicon Valley, Seattle, or maybe Columbus, Ohio. They have much better ratios. Another reason to get out of Rhode Island. All this reminds me of the Pew Institute's numbers on marriage success. Seems that between 2006 and 2010, college-educated women were nearly twice as likely to be married after 20 years or more. The probability of first marriages lasting that long, based on education, was all women, 52%. High school or less, 40%. Some college, 49%. And then, of course, though, all those college-educated ladies looking for partners in Rhode Island at 78%. So if it is a good idea to help our young college grad ladies to find partners to stay married to, we need to help the balance of boys and girls coming out of our colleges, ready to work. That, of course, means we have to have jobs for college grads in Rhode Island. Now, I came across an article from Women's Day written by Anna Schoening on January 9th of 2014. She quotes Jean Twenge, a PhD who wrote Generation Me. Anna's article lists the 10 best pieces of dating advice that the millennials, born after 1977, have to offer. Now, I thought I would review this list from the perspective of a boomer trying to live in a world where virtually everyone is younger. How are they coping? Well, I haven't the time today to go through the entire piece, but I did pick out some of the quotes within the 10 suggestions. So, if you are a Rhode Island college-educated lady, you need to follow this advice. These are not in the order the article has, but who cares? Here's a problem right away. Be picky. You are not supposed to settle for whoever comes along. You must find someone who appreciates you. Now, going back to John Berger's book, you are not supposed to be picky. Be open to dating and possibly seeking out men without college degrees. Quote, just because you went to college, it doesn't make you a better wife, etc., unquote. This guy said that we will see an increase in mixed collar marriages in the coming years. Seems likely. Here's another one. Seems millennials are using hanging out as a substitute for formal dating. Go for a walk, go for a coffee instead of going on an expensive restaurant date where the guy who's making less money than you pays. Here's a good one. There's no shame in being single. Seems millennials are marrying much later than we boomers. So when someone asks you about your lack of a partner in crime, you simply say, quote, "I'm available," unquote. The point being that you shouldn't feel bad about being single, particularly in Rhode Island. And this one, embrace online dating. Use OkCupid, Match.com, Tinder, and even for your Facebook. Since none of these things were around when I was dating, it's a little hard to appreciate, but I do know that both of my college-educated daughters met their husbands online. Enough said. There's lots more to learn from these articles, so I recommend you get right to it and read them. Thanks for watching, and God bless.